Welcome everyone to this LSE public event hosted by the SOSI HOK Southeast Asia Center. I am Shin, Professor of Geography and Urban Studies and Director of SOSI HOK Southeast Asia Center, or SIAC, here at LSE. This event forms part of LSE's Shaping the Post-COVID World initiative, a series imagining what the world would look like after the crisis and how we get there. The series will lead up to the LSE Festival 2022, which this year is taking place from Monday 13th to Saturday 18th of June in summer this year. We are delighted to welcome our speakers today, Dr. Rachel Gong, Dr. Sabina Lawreniuk, Dr. Murray Mckenzie, Dr. Do-Young Oh, and last but not least, Abbey Pangilinan, who is also an LSE alumna. So welcome back to Abbey. They are joining us from various parts of the world today, namely the UK, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Cambodia, and the Philippines. A few housekeeping points about this webinar. This event is being recorded and a video and podcast of the event may be hosted on our website shortly after the event. If for any reason you do not wish to appear in the recording, please email us and we'll remove you from the recording as needed. Please post any questions using the chat box or the Q&A box actually that can be found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And there will be an example to indicate your name, affiliation, location, and your question. If you'd like to tweet about this event, please be sure to tag us using the LSE Twitter handle and also the Twitter handle of LSE SEAC, which is LSE SEAC. And also use the hashtag LSE post-COVID. The event running order will be like this today. As the chair, I first introduce the background of the event, and especially given that this event is to mark the launch of the book, which is entitled COVID-19 in Southeast Asia, Insights for a Post-Pandemic World. I introduced as lead editor the background of the book as well, and before moving on to hearing from our co-editors, Dr. Murray Mckenzie and Dr. Do-Young Oh, who will provide their own reflection on the project itself and the book as well. Their interventions will be followed by the reflections of contributing authors, Rachel, Sabina, and Abbey. And each speaker will talk for up to 10 minutes, and I'll introduce each speaker in greater detail before they begin to speak. We aim to leave about 30 minutes for the Q&A session, and participants, again, as I mentioned earlier, can use the Q&A function of the Zoom to type your questions throughout the event, and I direct questions to our speakers. This event is expected to end at 1:30, so about 90 minutes long in total. So without further ado, let me first introduce the book. So this book, COVID-19 in Southeast Asia, Insights for a Post-Pandemic World, was initially conceived in early autumn 2020 as part of the project at the SOSI HOK Southeast Asia Center here at LSE. The project was a response to the COVID-19 challenges in Southeast Asia, based on the center's reflection that we need more regional voices as the world has had been grappling hard with the pandemic. Despite profound challenges facing the region of Southeast Asia, its voices have been underrepresented in many academic forums, and this was what we found out in summer 2020. In this regard, the research team at SEAC aimed to reflect upon what the crisis means for urbanization, governance, and connectivity in Southeast Asia, and to contemplate post-COVID-19 urban futures by initially focusing on three themes in particular. COVID-19 has obviously presented huge challenges to government, businesses, civil societies, and people from all walks of life, but its impact has been highly variegated, affecting society in multiple negative ways with uneven geographical and socioeconomic patterns. The crisis revealed the existing contradictions and inequalities in society, compelling us to question what it means to return to normal and what insights can be gleaned from Southeast Asia for thinking about a post-pandemic world. Here, it would be worth noting that the post as in post-pandemic does not necessarily mean a breakaway from the past. It is to internalize pre-pandemic as well as pandemic ways of seeing the world as we project the future. In this regard, the volume itself is a collection of informed views of an ensemble of social scientists who have specialized in area studies, development studies, legal studies, as well as anthropology, architecture, economics, and geography, and also planning, sociology, and urban studies. The volume represents academic institutions, or especially our contributors, they represent academic institutions, activist and charitable organizations, policy and research institutes, and areas of professional practices whose operation and work have been engaging with the region of Southeast Asia. These contributions represent a wide-ranging set of views, collectively producing a compilation of reflections on the following three themes in particular. And these are what the book has been divided into. So first, urbanization, digital infrastructures, economies, and the environment. Second, migrants, mobilities and immobilities, and borders. And third, collective action, communities, and mutual action. And overall, this edited volume aims to speak from a situated position in relevant debates to challenge knowledge about the pandemic that has assigned selective and inequitable visibility to issues, people, or places, or which through its inferential or interpretive capacity has worked to set social expectations or assign validity to certain interventions with a bearing on the pandemic's causes and the future it has foretold. The book also aims to advance or renew understandings of social challenges, risks, or inequities that were already in place in the region of Southeast Asia, and which without further or better actions are to be features of our post-pandemic world as well. And this volume also contributes to the ongoing efforts to decenter and decolonize knowledge production. And I'm very happy to report that the large majority of nearly 40 contributors in this volume are based in the region. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker today, who is Dr. Murray Mckenzie. Murray is a postdoctoral research assistant and research officer at the LSE Associate Southeast Asia Center and a strategic planning consultant. He holds a PhD in geography and urban studies from UCL and an MA in community and regional planning from the University of British Columbia. His research focuses on the roles of the arts, culture, and their contestation in processes of urban growth and change. So Murray, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hyun. It's nice to see you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll give Terry a moment to get my slides on the screen. There we are. For this talk, I took a journey back through the introduction to the book. And I want to use my few minutes to briefly reflect on what we saw as some of the intellectual, critical, political purpose behind producing such a book. And what actually becomes clear to me as I revisit this is how, at the time of producing the book, so much of our concerns were to do with maintaining its integrity and its purchase on events that we couldn't predict. And I think, in fact, we have to admit 2 years on that it's still actually very difficult, I think, to really put a fine point on what all of this means for us. And in fact, when you revisit the trans-institutional LSE theme of shaping a post-COVID world, it's not only the post which we can question, as Hyun points out, but also the idea of shaping something which actually appears increasingly shapeless, increasingly all-pervasive. And for those of us here in the UK, we now have determined that the pandemic is apparently something to which we cannot respond in any way at all. And we now accept that it is the reality that we just live with. Slide, please. And so the epigraph that opens the book, we took from Ulrich Beck's Risk Society, and it conveys exactly that point about the post that Hyun was making, which is that when faced with events like this, and the idea of a post-COVID world, which does appear to have no meaning and perhaps can't be really actually achieved in any literal posterior sense, there's really only the only option is, in fact, to use that post as a as a tool to confront the familiar past and present that you're supposedly negating. Slide. And so during the months in which this text was written, and actually, in fact, that would really actually be the blog, which then later became the book. Hyun, Do-young, and I and others would often meet to share texts that were being published and trying to decide where we would locate ourselves among all the different meanings that were being given to what was happening. And of course, at that time, the world felt as though it was in a sort of suspended transformation, stuck at home, dealing with the immediate and the personal issues that brought, while at the same time trying to find something decisive, something transformative, something hopeful, and so on. And in this talk, I'm not so much anchoring us in Southeast Asia, because I know that others will do that, but I want to show how the book relates to those intellectual reference points that were appearing around us. And we began compiling scholarly texts as they were published almost obsessively. In fact, we still have an archive of roughly 11 or 1200 texts that were published in about 250 journals, which we in fact have still not quite figured out how to make sense of, simply just because of the sheer incoherence of it all. In any case, I begin with this quote from Arundhati Roy, the Indian activist and writer, who wrote this very influential piece in the Financial Times, which suggested that the pandemic would serve as a portal or a gateway between one world and the next. And it was our wish for this volume to evince some of this hopefulness and incisiveness of its treatment of the circumstances that the pandemic was bringing differently or more clearly into view. Slide. And at the same time, we were also aware of the challenge brought by some of our urbanist colleagues, which was that these sort of monumental claims would actually, in fact, risk doing a disservice to the experience of urban majorities, particularly in the global south, where emerging infectious diseases would be just one risk among those that would constitute an enduring crisis. For many urban residents, of course, there's been no lockdown, no social distancing, no substantial change to provisions for sanitation or public health. These effects would often fall to critical social scientists to make known. Slide, please. And so this is how we anchored ourselves. We saw the evidence of disciplinary disjuncture and incoherence, but also the possibility for deeper analysis and reflection through which concepts and theories would begin to coalesce. And we wish to bring this together into the book by gathering up the work of our colleagues. Slide, please. So if I take those first 11 or 1200 titles that we collected, and I did this recently, which is to put them into the titles into a word frequency calculator. The two most common phrases in all of the titles are the impact of COVID-19 and various variations on in the time of COVID-19. I think that reflects something quite important about the way in which we responded to this as social scientists. There are essentially two fundamental perspectives here, neither of which would claim us to suddenly become experts in infectious diseases, but instead to see this as a sort of portal, as Arundhati Roy sets out. On one hand, you have the situated position in relevant debates that allows you to challenge knowledge about the pandemic, which, as Hyun says, selectively assigns visibility. It sets social expectations, assigns validity to certain interventions, which we discussed quite a bit early on in the pandemic. And indeed, the way that knowledge has a bearing on the pandemic's course and that future of the post-pandemic world. And on the other hand, so many of us chose to write about our own areas of interest in the times of the pandemic, to take the events and the consequences to advance or renew understandings of social challenges, risks, and inequities. Those which, without further or better action, would become features of the post-pandemic world as well. For perhaps all of us with the pandemic, including the suspension of our most primary research activities, it was a time for a critical reevaluation of our research areas and our subfields. By grounding this volume in Southeast Asia, we wanted to secure a place, of course, for a region that was among the first outside of East Asia to be confronted with COVID-19. In that archive of scholarly research we collected, we found that only 3.4% of articles or texts thoroughly described or analyzed experiences of the pandemic in Southeast Asia. Now, of course, that's entirely English language scholarship, but nevertheless, given academic practices around the world, it's quite a large distance between 3.4% in a region that represents 2/5 of the world's population. Slide, please. And so to take Beck's Risk Society as the initial basis for summing up what it is that holds this outburst of scholarship together, and what an original critical undertaking might collectively advance, you have effectively two major perspectives that we can take in what we can do as scholars, as social scientists, to challenge what's going on. The first is to challenge the social existence that risks acquire through their social construction. This has always been an essential premise of geographers' critical inventions into global health, and the differentiated manner in which visibility is created and interventions are made possible. But we've seen consistently throughout the pandemic the vital purpose of this kind of scholarship in challenging rationalities and causal interpretations, challenging social expectations and value judgments, the ways in which the pandemic is understood and addressed. And secondly, we wanted to feature research that would challenge the way that risks are unevenly distributed, the way that they amplified existing inequalities and complicated them, evident at all scales, from the interpersonal to the global. Many of the risks and consequences of overproduction, as we've seen, are displaced by a combination of design and circumstance onto the same disadvantaged groups for whom scarcity is a real predicament. You can think, for instance, of the informal settlements of Jakarta that are most vulnerable to pollution, flooding, and land subsidence. And these two are the groups that are most likely to lack the information and resources needed to recognize and avoid risks to which they are exposed. And it was David Harvey, early in the pandemic, who challenged that familiar refrain that we were all in this together, which he said is only a cloak over outcomes differentiated by class, gender, race, ethnicity, and so on. And sorry, I think there's another slide. Is there another slide? Good. And so finally, the question would be, to return to Arundhati Roy's challenge, if the pandemic is a portal, what is it a portal to? And there is, on one hand, the possibility of an answer that seizes the opportunity to construct a community of global risk, potentially in terms of that imminent collectivity, a great awakening to intersectional equivalences. You see this in a lot of the social sciences, where the pandemic could be a catalyst for a global development paradigm, perhaps a sustainability transition, an ethics of care, and so on. And the second part of the answer, or the opposite answer, is to step back from commonality of positive social change. Commonality could be, in fact, precisely the way in which we defer responsibility, and instead to suggest that it's actually the anxiety of negative social change that is what animates critical thinking. Negative in the sense that it's not about what we need or what we want, but simply that the demand to be spared from exposure to danger, to the dangers we've collectively produced. In other words, to say that the portal we want most of all is simply a portal to something other than this. I hope that helps sketch out some of our initial thinking, and I'll stop there. But look forward to the discussion, and very pleased to share this book with you all, and to have finally reached a point where we can return to some of these ideas and think through them again. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. It's certainly a very wonderful introduction to the volume, and also to thinking about what it means to think of a pandemic as a portal to where, especially when it comes to thinking about the tension between the positive and negative social changes, which continuously come to dominate the mindset and the actions of various countries across the world. Next speaker will be Dr. Do-Young Oh, who is a research assistant professor at the School of Graduate Studies at Lingnan University in Hong Kong. Do-Young was previously a research officer based at jointly at SEAC and the Middle East Center here at the LSE. where he completed his PhD in regional urban planning studies. And his research interest focused on comparative urbanism and post-colonialism in East Asia. So, Do-young, over to you.
Okay. Hello from Hong Kong. This is Do-young. It's my great pleasure to be here to share my experience as a co-editor of this volume and introduce our edited volume before we inviting our contributors to introduce their chapter today. After the publication of this volume, one of my non-academic friends checked this book and asked me questions. So what is the future of Southeast Asia? Like, what are the key points and so on? After receiving these questions, I realized that others might think the same way, expecting more concrete answers about the post-pandemic world. However, we are definitely not a group of fortune tellers, so we cannot offer an immediate answer to that. Still, I believe that this edited volume can be good guidance, telling you various critical issues in the region and the directions society is currently heading toward. So if you finish reading this volume, you will probably agree with me that you have a deeper understanding of the region's current affairs. So this volume has 24 chapters, an introduction and postscript. We try to include all the countries in the region, but in the end, we don't have chapters on Laos and Brunei, as well as East Timor. But still, we were able to invite a diverse range of contributors, including senior to early career academics, researchers, and activists across various disciplines. I will move to the next slide to briefly introduce about 3 parts of the book. So regarding the first part, urbanization, digital infrastructure, economies, and the environment, this part shows that COVID-19 is a catalytic crisis that has accelerated processes of social change. So COVID-19 is a momentum to rebuild the existing social issues more clearly. And there are both positive and negative directions we found. So some of our chapters show that COVID-19 is deepening global, national, and regional inequalities. Digital technologies often work in a positive way to support vulnerable groups of society, but the technologies are also mobilized by the state as a means of surveillance. I guess we will learn more about these issues later by speakers with us today. For the second part, for migrants, immobilities, and borders, we learned that COVID-19 shows how the region is closely connected to each other and with other parts of the world. People from the region have played a critical role in supporting others. There are nurses, domestic workers, seamen, and so on. Despite their contributions to many different parts of the world, our chapter shows that existing structural inequality has had a more severe impact on them. Again, our speaker here, Abbey, will tell us more rich stories later. Lastly, collective action, communities, and mutual aid part. Here, there is a bit of silver lining, even though people in the region are suffering not only the COVID-19 pandemic, but also other events like the Myanmar coup in 2021. We found that despite the presence of authoritarian state in Southeast Asia, communities are considerably important to respond to the crisis. In this regard, we introduced various kinds of efforts done by civil society as a response to ongoing pandemic. I think these findings also resonate with our postscript calling ethics of care against this pandemic and socio-economic and political challenges we are facing. We expect that mutual aid and care we learn from these chapters continue further and keep making real change of society. So when we start this project and circulated a call for contributions for the LSE Southeast Asia blog in July 2020, I personally never expected that we would ended up publishing this volume. But we were overwhelmed by active responses by people having different backgrounds and different experiences. As a result, almost 50 blog posts are now available on LSE Southeast Asia blog regarding the COVID-19 issues. So we were definitely motivated by these active responses and felt responsible to spread their voices further using our tools. So we decided to publish them as an edited volume in the end. We thought LSE Press could be our best choice because LSE Press can understand our intention and provide full support for the volume. And this book is also freely available for everyone as well. So my reflection is that the privileged institution like LSE need to listen to more voices from different parts of the world, including Southeast Asia, and to give more platforms to them to talk about themselves. So when you actually check many books and edited volumes regarding COVID-19, there are plenty of books you can find. And if you see where they are produced, you will probably agree with me. Like scholars in the region are facing various challenges, but opportunities for them to speak and for us to learn from them have been very limited in this regard. I'm very proud of this volume as an outcome of such an effort. We have closely worked with people in the region and reflected their voices, as Hyun mentioned earlier. So I believe sets it apart from other books about COVID-19. That's all for my part now. But before handing over, I must thank LSE Press, including Professor Patrick Dunleavy and Lucy Lamb, for their sincere support of the volume, as well as all the contributors and other colleagues at Socioc Southeast Asia Center who provided support for the entire process. Also, last but least, thanks to LSE Comms team to facilitate this event. I will now hand the screen over to Hyun. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you so much. Do-young, you stole my lines when it comes to thanking people, but I think it's always...
Again and again.
Yes, indeed, yes. Next, we'll be hearing from our contributors, starting with Dr. Rachel Gong, who is a senior researcher at Khazanah Research Institute in Malaysia. Khazanah Research Institute is a policy tank based in Kuala Lumpur, and Rachel's current research covers digital policy issues such as digital inclusion, the digital economy, and digital governance. Her earlier research has been published in Sociological Perspectives, the Journal of Consumer Culture, and the Journal of Technology in Human Services. And Rachel graduated summa cum laude from Princeton University and received her PhD in sociology from Stanford University in the US. And her contribution to the volume was a co-author piece that examined digital transformation, education, and adult learning in Malaysia. So over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Hyun. I'll get my slides up as well. So let me start by also thanking LSE and the Socioc Southeast Asia Center for this opportunity to be part of the book and the book launch, and to be sharing the screen with this group of scholars here today. Very much looking forward to hearing everyone's presentations. Let me take a moment to acknowledge my co-authors, Ashraf Shaharuddin and Siti Aisha Tumin, as well as the other contributors to this book and the editors, Hyun, Murray, and Do-young, who brought us all together. I know publishing a book is very much a collective effort. I'm very thankful and grateful to be a part of this one. So as Hyun mentioned, I am a sociologist currently based at the Khazanah Research Institute in Kuala Lumpur, where I lead the team that works on digital policy research. We published our book titled Network Nation last June. And so the launch of this book, COVID-19 in Southeast Asia, Insights for a Post-Pandemic World, is an opportune moment for us to locate some of the work that we've done on Malaysia in the wider context of Southeast Asia. Much like the coronavirus, digital transformation affects all parts of society, but it doesn't affect all of society equally. In our chapter, the Digital Transformation, Education and Adult Learning in Malaysia, my co-authors and I discussed digital learning inequalities, both in schools and in the labor force. And these are just one example of the challenges facing Malaysia and really most countries in struggling to adapt to life in the pandemic. Malaysia relied heavily on digital technologies when the pandemic first hit its shores, and office workers were forced to work from home. Schools and universities had to go online and have classes online. And one thing we did see was that e-commerce and food deliveries really started to grow and boom. In fact, last February, Malaysia's government sort of reacted and responded by releasing a digital economy blueprint with aspirations to make the nation a leader in Southeast Asia's digital economy. And I think one's reach should exceed one's grasp, but this ambitious growth cannot come about without inclusive development and good governance. Lived experience on the ground reveals that even as some traditional digital divides are narrowing, such as household internet access, new digital challenges are emerging, such as digital competency gaps. Inequitable opportunities are reproduced, even exacerbated, as an overdependence on digital systems privileges the socioeconomic elite and makes socioeconomic inequalities worse. So without having proper checks and balances, technologies that were intended to level the playing field can make it more uneven. Social technical solutions are needed that will prioritize the public interest and social well-being, as technology that is developed and implemented by elites, no matter how innovative, will not adequately address existing and new structural inequalities without more engagement with affected communities. So we need more public interest technologies who study and apply their technological expertise to advance the public interest, generate public benefits, and endorse the public good. Let me provide some context on Malaysia for those of you who might not be familiar with the country. With a population of about half the size of the United Kingdom and a median monthly household income of about 2/5 of that of the UK, Malaysia is doing relatively well in terms of household internet access and COVID vaccination rates. One of the challenges that Malaysia is facing in its pandemic recovery efforts is in addressing digital skills gaps in its labor force and improving digital literacy among its population. And that includes ensuring that school children are receiving the education that they need in order to thrive in a digitally transformed society, including an economy that is increasingly data-driven. In our chapter, we discuss how digitalization has been necessary during the pandemic, but is likely not sufficient in its wake. We highlight how education was disrupted in Malaysia in 2020. Schools closed at least 17 out of 43 weeks, and not all students were able to transition to studying online. Approximately 77% of students could not easily pivot to online classes due to limited digital resources at home, whether this be in terms of lack of devices or not having enough data on their internet plans. And this disadvantage, as you might expect, was disproportionately borne by students from low-income households. Estimates also suggested that at most 28% of Malaysian jobs could be done remotely, compared to about 37% of US jobs, as many workers were laid off or underemployed, and estimates suggested that unemployment peaked at about 5% in 2020 due to the pandemic constraints. The government made efforts to offer reskilling and upskilling trainings for job seekers, especially with respect to digital skills. At the time of writing, we didn't have statistics on the take-up rate for these trainings, but if history is any indicator, the training participation rate in Malaysia is unlikely to exceed 25%. Since then, we've learned that as of October 2021, schools in Malaysia closed for about 42 weeks since the start of the pandemic, the third highest in Southeast Asia behind Cambodia and Myanmar. A World Bank simulation study estimated that this could lead to up to 1.3 additional years of learning loss for Malaysian students. And although the government did its best to distribute 150,000 students to 150,000 laptops to needy students, especially those in rural and remote areas, students still face challenges with online learning. Meanwhile, digital job vacancies increased 3.5 times between 2020 and 2021. But again, as of October 2021, the Malaysian Department of Statistics estimated that youth unemployment, that is measuring the unemployment for job seekers aged 15 to 24, was at 13.9%, over 3 times the national unemployment rate of 4.3%. Skills mismatch between job seekers and employers remains an issue, and dissatisfaction among the workplace is an emerging concern. Facing pressures to digitalize and automate, employers who are in Malaysia mostly small and medium-sized enterprises are likely to face more challenges in finding suitable workers and retaining them in their pandemic recovery efforts. So where does this leave us? In my opinion, we have crossed a digital Rubicon and there is no going back. Life in a post-pandemic world will be digital. We will need to go beyond digitization, which makes analog things digital, like scanning a document for archiving. And we cannot allow digital literacy to remain limited to just highly trained technical people or in specific sectors of the economy. Digital transformation in a post-pandemic world requires considering how the use of digital technologies also transforms society, from communications and education to finding a job and buying a house. We will have to adapt our attitudes on digital technologies and take socio-technical, not just technical, approaches to coming up with digital policy. I'd like to highlight 4 principles that I believe can inform good policy making. First, inclusive design. We're going to need technological tools that can be meaningfully used by all groups of people, including and especially the vulnerable and disenfranchised. For example, having translations of websites, public service websites in particular, into multiple languages can be very helpful, especially translation into languages spoken by large migrant communities. On a separate but unrelated note, Jarod Ramadan Khalidi and Tan Teng Teng's chapter in this book on the economic case against the marginalization of migrant workers in Malaysia highlights the plight of these migrant workers and asks how digital transformation in the form of automation will affect this community. It's worth asking how design can be more inclusive, not just in terms of designing technological tools, but of technological systems and processes more broadly. The second principle is prioritizing the user perspective. Digital transformation should benefit the masses, not just the elites, and more attention should be paid to the user experience. For example, by evaluating internet performance by what speeds users are receiving, especially again in remote and rural areas, instead of relying on performance metrics reported by service providers. Or assessing digital pedagogy by student engagement or learning outcomes, rather than relying on educational tech platforms, functions, and features. A third principle of good policymaking is good governance, which ranges from making systems interoperable and secure to ensuring that data are properly managed. As already highlighted, Munyati Yatid and Falina Said's chapter on data privacy, security, and the future of data governance in Malaysia offers some suggestions for policymakers on this subject. And we can see how cross-border regulations are going to become increasingly important in a globally networked world. Fourth, prioritizing the public interest. Pardon my coming across as repetitive on this point, but time and time again, we see policies that are being developed that favor private interests, even when it comes to developing public infrastructure. And while it's true that many of the digital apps that we are familiar with are private sector innovations, the backbone of the technology on which they run was largely developed using public funds. And so it is public interest and social well-being that we need to prioritize now as we emerge into a post-pandemic world. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. I do look forward to engaging with you on some of the questions that you may have. Please feel free to reach out and connect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think those 4 principles will be very useful starting point for thinking about digital inclusion, and not only for Malaysia, but for many other countries across the world. Hopefully we can come back to some of these points during the Q&A session. Next will be Dr. Sabina Lorenik, who is joining us from Cambodia. Sabina is a Nottingham Research Fellow in the School of Geography at the University of Nottingham. She is the co-author of Going Nowhere Fast, Mobile Inequality in the Age of Translocality. And her contribution in this volume was a co-author piece that examined global precarity chains and the economic impact on Cambodia's garment workers. Over to you, Sabina.
Great, thank you so much, Hyun. I hope you can see the slides here. Let me just go to the beginning of the deck. Great, yeah, so thank you very much, Hyun, for inviting us to be part of this exciting launch of the book. And thanks to everyone also who's joined us today. As Hyun said, I'm Sabina Lawreniuk. I'm a Nottingham Research Fellow in the School of Geography at the University of Nottingham. But today I'm here to represent a bigger research collaboration that we call the Refashion Study. Refashion is funded by the GCRF in the UK, and it's a collaboration between UK universities led by Professor Catherine Brickell at Royal Holloway and our partners at the Cambodia Development Resource Institute in Phnom Penh. So in particular here, I'd like to highlight the contributions of two members of CDRI, TV Chom and Batay So, who've co-authored this chapter with us. Just for clarity, however, any opinions that I share today are my own and they don't necessarily reflect the views of those other team members. For 2 years now, our Refashion team has been tracking the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on a cohort of 200 female garment workers in Cambodia. We've been tracking them from January 2020 right through to December 2021. The study combined a quantitative survey on income and well-being with our 200 participants with a qualitative round of interviews to explore emergent themes in a bit more depth. Each of these components was repeated with the same cohort of workers at strategic intervals. So in this way, the research was designed to enable us to capture an in-depth and long-term understanding of women's lives through the pandemic. The LSE Press book chapter was the very first output that we were able to contribute from our study, and it reflects on the findings from the first round of our research, covering the period of time between January 2020 and January 2021. And in the chapter, we share a perspective on the first year of the pandemic through the eyes of two of the participants in our study, who we call Lida and Chantu, although these are not actually the participants' real names. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, there were up to 1 million garment workers in Cambodia working in factories just like this one in the image here. 80% of those workers, like Lida and Chantu, were women. And although they don't always do this work out of choice, people like Lida and Chantu, rather with limited levels of education and skills, in an economy that's often struggled to diversify beyond garments, there simply aren't a lot of alternatives open to them. So as Lida confided to us here at the beginning of our project, I always think about finding another job, but I don't know if I've got any ability or capacity. I can only dream, but I can't find a way to follow my dream. Like elsewhere in Southeast Asia, Cambodia's emergency health response in that first year of the pandemic was widely heralded as a success, with very few cases and 0 deaths recorded. But Cambodia's achievements at mitigating the direct health impacts of COVID-19 couldn't protect its population from the economic fallout of the pandemic. Instead, the impacts of manufacturing shutdowns and lockdowns all around the world took a huge hit on the garment sector's output. Tens of thousands of women in Cambodia were put out of work on a permanent basis, and hundreds of thousands more were suspended for temporary intervals or found their working hours were reduced. Through that first year, this happened to Lida often, as she explained. The factory announced that the buyer has cancelled product orders, therefore they don't have much work for all the workers. They've decided to change the shift patterns, which means that I can only work between 10 and 14 days for the whole of January. This, at this point, is January 2021. So for the workers in our study, the effect of these job losses and unstable hours had a really huge impact on their income. Typical wages of $240 a month in January had dropped quite dramatically to $147 by May, and their average pay over the period was $180 a month, which is a reduction of 25% on their expected earnings. Crucially, even at their peak in January 2020, the typical wages of the garment industry worker in Cambodia are already significantly below what we would describe as living wage levels. That is the amount that a worker needs to meet the basic needs of herself and her family for costs like housing and food. So although she'd been working in the garment industry since 2008, a typical worker like Lida had not managed to make regular savings from her salary to help her through this downturn. As we found out, actually, it was quite the opposite. Instead, Lida had taken microcredit loans totaling more than $8,000. That's more than 3 times her annual salary as a garment worker. We found that in the absence of comprehensive social protection, many workers had been engaging in forms of debt-financed social reproduction for many years. During that first year of the pandemic, when their incomes dropped, however, they no longer had the salaries to meet the cost of their monthly loan repayments. Lida's $8,000 debt, for example, left her needing to make repayments of $193 every month. So as she explained again, during the suspension, therefore, I cried every night. I asked the loan officer, how can I repay the loan? But he just said, Auntie, there's nothing I can do to help you with that. So Lida and many of our other participants were forced to make cutbacks any way that they could, making further sacrifices within the already fine margins of everyday household expenditure. The leading adaptations reported in our survey were to spend less money on daily living costs and food in particular. The average household food budget in the study had dropped from something like $4.40 per day in January 2020 to $2.70 by the end of the year. That's a very significant fall of about 39%. A situation of chronic food insecurity, therefore, developed. By October 2020, 55% of our participants could recall a time when their households ate less than they thought they should because of a lack of money or other resources. 20% of participants could recall a time when they were hungry but they didn't eat at all. As Lida says here, I'd go to work every day, I just eat rice and I can't desire any other snacks because I can't afford it. She described this to our team through tears. I can only tell you one word to describe my situation, and that's hardship. I've reduced my spending on food. Some days we have only eggs for meals. So in our chapter, we draw from these experiences of Lida and Chantu and our other participants throughout the first year of the pandemic to think critically about the role of global supply chains in promoting economic development. Much of the literature describes supply chains as a win-win, bringing mutual benefits for business, for labour and for national economies. But building on the alternative perspective shared by our workers in the study, we instead advance the idea of global precarity chains as a better way to capture their unstable and unequal dynamics as volatile and exploitative networks of business and trade that provide flexible and insecure forms of work that produce a reliance on unsustainable debt and a very uncertain existence for labour, as Lida's testimony here illustrates. I'm so depressed about this, Lida shared with us back in January 2021. I seem to have mental health problems. I keep thinking all night about these worries. Now, although the volatile and exploitative dynamics that we highlight here were revealed by the pandemic, they weren't caused by it. COVID-19 has not made COVID value chains newly precarious. Rather, it's exposed and exacerbated long-standing vulnerabilities that women had already been navigating on a daily basis before the pandemic's arrival, and which they now carry forward into the post-pandemic era. Through subsequent rounds of research, we've engaged with our participants again and again as the economic crisis in Cambodia turned first into a health emergency, and then as the vaccine rollout has precipitated something of a return to a new normal. At times, Lida was rendered unable to work through lockdowns and quarantines. At other times, she was compelled to work through outbreaks of the virus, as a result of which she was later infected with COVID-19. Throughout this whole period, she's confronted the growing informalization of work in the sector and a deepening reliance on credit to finance her family's everyday subsistence. We therefore believe that global precarity chains remain an increasingly salient concept for understanding the contemporary transnational organisation of work and production. And we share Lida's hope in the final quote here, that the experiences of these women can serve as an urgent call to address the vulnerabilities of work in global supply chains through robust social protection programming in the post-pandemic future. Thank you all again for the opportunity to share this work again, and please do follow updates if you're interested at our project website or Twitter feed. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sabina. I think the proposal to introduce this concept of global precarity chain is definitely going to be adding a lot of weight to critical discourses and debates on the fate of these workers, like garment workers in Cambodia, and something that will be probably providing us with some more critical insight in a way that may be different from what we may gain from such terms like in a global production network or global value chains. So that was from Sabina, and we move on to our last but not least, our speaker from the Philippines, Abbey. Over to you. Oh, sorry. Let me also introduce Abbey. Abbey Pangilinan is a development worker and urban planner who specializes in implementing social protection programs in both urban and rural context. She has a master's degree in urban and regional planning from the University of the Philippines and a master's degree in urbanization development from the London School of Economics. And her Cohort chapter examines the repatriated overseas Filipino workers. So over to you, Abbey.
Thank you, Hyun. Thank you for the opportunity. It's really an honor on behalf of my co-authors, Ika Fernandez, Tanya Quijano, and Justin Muyot, to be invited to submit a chapter to the book. Congratulations. So I'm sorry I don't have a presentation. I want to make this quick. It's a 10-minute talk. So I just want to give a background on the context on why my co-authors and I put together that article. So in the middle of 2020, we were actually reflecting on writing a different article that would focus on human rights and how it's being constantly violated in the Philippines by the government in its pandemic response. But one of the issues that surfaced and was clear to us as development workers was the plight of overseas Filipino workers. And we felt that in the middle of all the precarity that we are facing, it is important to surface the issue. And the invitation to submit a blog post was timely for us to surface it, and also to call for action on the part of government to address the growing concern of migrant workers. So at the time, there were around 600,000 overseas Filipino workers, or OFWs, affected. And sadly, this number increased in the span of 8 months from when we wrote this article. The number is now close to 1 million repatriated workers to date. So the problem is actually still very much present, that the government has yet to implement a comprehensive program to assist displaced overseas Filipino workers and their families. So the discussion is actually more centered on who are overseas Filipino workers and what is happening to the close to 1 million OFWs who have been displaced in the 2 years of the pandemic. So overseas Filipino workers are actually a combination of both professional and those involved in manual or elementary positions doing manual labor, such as construction and domestic work. So approximately 2.2 million OFWs are scattered worldwide, and they make the Philippines the fourth largest destination of remittances as of 2020 World Bank data. And this remittances account for close to 8 or 9% of the country's GDP, even during the pandemic. So just to highlight and underscore the focus of our chapter, it really is on the situation of migrant families, the families of overseas Filipino workers, that they are not affluent. So they get by and are still highly dependent on monthly wages and remittances sent by the family member abroad. So with the pandemic and its unexpected scale, a lot of the overseas Filipino families suffer the blow economically. So what happens is that they are already confronted with multiple vulnerabilities pre-pandemic, which is the reason why they had to send a family member abroad to buffer that. When the pandemic struck, a lot of them lost a significant portion of household income because of the scenario that their primary breadwinner lost their jobs abroad and are now being sent home. So the plight is actually not just of the OFW, of the overseas Filipino worker that is being repatriated, but of their families here in the Philippines. So we tried to surface that this isn't the first time that the Philippines is actually tasked to handle a massive repatriation. This is actually probably the only time that it is confronted with repatriation at this scale, and it is in a pandemic context that is all new to us. So the typical menu of services and programs and processes might not work. So adjustments and resources are needed for food, transportation assistance, and hotel quarantine, plus ensuring that the repatriated overseas Filipino worker gets home to their provinces safely. But as we all know, you've probably heard in global news that the Philippines is actually ranking very low in terms of overall pandemic response. So the overseas Filipinos are actually one of the sectors greatly affected. They suffered the brunt of nationwide lockdowns, which rendered the country immobile for months. So we had the strictest lockdown probably in Southeast Asia, and we had to deal with confusing policies, varying border controls, and the lack of coordination between the national and the local government. The local governments are, in this case, the receiving communities of the repatriated overseas Filipino workers. So in the process, a lot of the returning overseas Filipino workers are in limbo. They were stuck mostly without enough money. So a lot of them ended up in jam-packed stadiums, running out of cash and waiting for their flights home. And for those who are even in more desolate situations, they had to live on the streets across the airport while waiting for their flights home. So it's really an issue from the perspective of my co-authors and I, because we've been doing development work for the past decade or so. So the bigger problem is actually more structural, as discussed by the other panelists, that for a Southeast Asian country like the Philippines, the long-term issues that we needed to address were actually magnified by the pandemic, including the issue of reintegration for overseas Filipino workers and the social aspect of having to face the stigma of losing their jobs, being sent home, the lack of dignity of how they were handled the moment they land into the Philippines, and of course the added burden that they might be vectors of the disease. So all of this needed to be addressed immediately as waves of repatriated overseas Filipinos continue to come. So what we reflected on is that as the Philippine government continued to implement a highly militarized approach to handling a health crisis, it cannot be the local governments and the private sector carrying much of the burden. It's not sustainable. It will definitely not address the core of the problem. So it has to be a whole of nation, a whole of government approach that is necessary to be able to support what we call bagong bayani, or in English modern day heroes. So in the absence of all of this, we think it is important to develop and acknowledge that the economic and social cost of the pandemic is still here. We're not yet in the post-pandemic world, so policies cannot be made in a vacuum. We have to acknowledge that adjustments had to be made, and publicly funded safety nets had to be put in place, because the burden of survival cannot be put upon neighbors, relatives, fellow Filipinos through individual efforts. So that's one. And second, good governance practices is still very much essential. I don't know if the people are familiar with how the Philippines has been confronted with a lot of corruption issues the past year, even within the pandemic. So the government has to step up and look at the pandemic as a chance to reimagine the way we treat and handle our overseas Filipino workers, and to start thinking about protecting their rights through better bilateral agreements, and ensuring that the current generation of migrants can receive adequate assistance that are due them. So my final point, our final point when we reflected on this is that treating people with dignity is still necessary, even when you are the government is actually literally falling apart in terms of handling the health crisis. With the pandemic approaching its second year and our government still acting as if it's over and that people can fend for themselves and keep each other alive. And it's likely going to stretch for at least another year. We're having our elections in May, so it depends on how it would pan out. But still, it shouldn't discount the reality and the fact that we have to give attention to long overdue reforms, and that the new normal for overseas Filipinos is highly dependent on how well its government will take care of them as they reintegrate to society or prepare for redeployment given other opportunities abroad. But at the end of it all, we refer to them as modern day heroes, and it's just about time to give them that kind of treatment that they deserve. So that's all I can say, and please do ask questions if you have any. Thank you.
But thank you so much, and thanks to all our speakers for making your intervention concise and right on time. We'll now be going through the questions using the starting with those ones which are posted in our Q&A section. And if you do have any questions as you listen to further discussions, please do use the Q&A to post your questions again. I think we'll start with a couple of questions which are directed to Rachel's intervention more specifically regarding digital issues. So here, and after Rachel's response, I may also direct some of the questions to Sabina and Abbey, especially in relation to what has been asked by our members of audience, is particularly Isato and Raxmi, when it comes to thinking about the kind of in a global or regional coordination and cooperation to address the economic impact of the pandemic, and also in thinking about what measures are to be implemented in to combat the COVID-19 and prepare the region for post-COVID world. And I guess in this case, for Sabina and Abbey, it might be useful actually for you to reflect upon global and regional initiatives that you may envisage necessary for the protection of government workers and overseas Filipino workers. And I guess perhaps Rachel, I might come back to you afterwards regarding that global and regional level of cooperation regarding digital inclusion and so on. But for now, we have a question from Professor Patrick Dunleavy, who's editor-in-chief of LSE Press, who's asking Rachel this question: whether the Malaysian government managed to continue working mostly unchanged in the pandemic, for example, by staff working from home, and does the government seek to leverage digital change within its own processes, or is it only concerned with digital education from the viewpoint of private firms? We have a related question also directed to Rachel specifically, and this one comes from Master's Will Howard, who is master's student in regional and urban planning studies at LSE, who is asking this question regarding this digital inequality, which has been an issue in the US and also which will be an issue across the world. And in his understanding, it would appear less people are able to work remotely in Malaysia. And if that's the case, how does this vary regionally in Southeast Asia, more broadly speaking, and how much effort has been made to make a digital transition? What is the appetite or culture for going back to the office? All right, over to you, Rachel.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Let me start with Professor Dunleavy's question on the Malaysian government. I think broadly speaking, the government has, unless I'm very mistaken on this, has preferred to work from the office. And even though there is an effort to digitalize some processes, for example, to have forms being submitted and sent around online. At the end of the day, when it comes to things like, stamping legal forms or things like that, that still has to be done in the office. So insofar as official government business has been conducted, Malaysian government workers, the civil service has functioned by cutting down the number of people who are in office at any one time to facilitate physical distancing, but has still, up to this point, been primarily work from office. Having said that, as part of the digital economic blueprint that I mentioned earlier, Malaysia has made a commitment to try to digitalize the public sector. And that includes, upskilling workers and giving them the right understanding of how digital processes should be so that they can revamp some of these things and really streamline the process to accept, for example, digital signatures and PDF fillable forms rather than printing out and rescanning and emailing and that sort of thing. But it's slow going at the moment. One effort that really has been pushed is cashless payments. And there's a strong effort to make cashless transactions available for all public service transactions. And that raises inequality questions of its own for people who don't have the necessary digital competencies or devices that can support that. But there is an effort within the public sector to try and get that going. On to Will's question on working from home and employment inequality. I'm not able to estimate or assess what the situation is in other countries in Southeast Asia, but there have been market research surveys done among office workers in 5 cities in Malaysia. And the result is basically that approximately 50% of them have had some experience. These are office workers in urban areas. About 50% of them have had some flexibility in either working from home or taking a hybrid working arrangement over the last couple of years. But interestingly enough, the preference of majority of these people, I think about 52%, if I'm not mistaken, or if not 52%, then it's about 50%, is actually to work from the office. And that might again be a factor of not having the right devices at home, not having an adequate office set up at home, and therefore preferring to work in the office. Another factor that's likely coming to that is that a lot of the offices in Malaysia are likely to be air conditioned, and that makes a difference in the tropical heat here. So there could be a preference towards working from the office there. I think I've tackled the 2 big ones there, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we move to Sabina's response, let me bring Abbey to respond to this question that is addressed to Abbey regarding the government Philippine workers. So it's a question from Emily, who's asking, I imagine a large proportion of migrant workers may choose to stay in the country where they work overseas. And I wonder if there's any thinking around how to support these workers if and while they choose to remain overseas. And already here I'm thinking of those domestic workers in places like Hong Kong and Singapore, as I read this out. And the most recent news report that I read about, which talks about how some of the domestic workers in Hong Kong who are contracted and who contracted COVID had to stay on the street as rob sleepers because they didn't have any shelters to go to. Anyway, Abbey, over to you, and then we'll move on to Sabina next.
Yeah,
Abbey.
thank you for the question, Emily. Quickly, the data that we were able to get from government indicates that there are actually a lot of displaced overseas Filipinos who wish to come home, hence the repatriation demand. But for those who would wish to stay, there are actually overseas workers, welfare offices who can assist them to find alternative employment interim while they are trying to determine if they will stay for long or come home. But these are limited with the capacity manpower resources, because the government doesn't really have sufficient support for this overseas welfare offices in destination countries. I don't know if I'm able to answer that, but to anchor it on Yoon's sharing about Hong Kong domestic workers, even with the surge, there are still a lot of workers who opt to stay with the thought that they will get alternative employment, but of course that's very difficult. And so our embassies and these assistance officers are stretched beyond their capacity to provide immediate relief and to even provide shelter for the domestic workers. Hence, a lot of the challenges are still very much present. I'm sorry if I'm garbled,
Thank you so
but
much.
I hope I'm able to answer that.
Thank you. Well, regarding domestic workers, the book also has a chapter written by Dr. Laura Antona, who has been discussing the impact of COVID on domestic workers in Singapore, where she talks about how domestic workers in Singapore have been experiencing COVID in a way that is a continuation of what they used to experience in the country, and also on one hand, and also on the other, a bit of breakaway from what it used to be. So the continuity aspect will be more or less how the inequities continue to prevail, and also to some extent, because domestic workers are largely confined to domestic space for most of the time, the whole isolation experience doesn't really necessarily become different during the COVID time from what it used to be previously, but also a breakaway in terms of how the prevailing the level of stress can be even harder because they don't have any outlet, especially as they have had to continuously face the scrutiny and to some extent surveillance exercised by their employers, and therefore the COVID-19 adding greater stress level and anxiety without having a chance to interact with their peers, and also stay away from the employer for any rest and recuperation. So please check out the chapter by Laura Antona about domestic workers. Now, back to Sabina. So this question about possible measures at regional and global level to address the precarity of government workers. I guess the question can be related to many other workers who are in a precarious situation. So Sabina, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Hyun. Yeah, it's a really great question because one of the things that makes these global precarity chains so precarious is simply the fact that the international, multinational brands from places like the UK and Europe and the US that are purchasing from countries in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the world, they typically have very little direct investment in these countries. So the factories that I'm showing you in those images there, the places where people like Lida and Chantu work, they are not owned by the big global brands like Nike or Adidas, and other global brands are also available. Instead, these are suppliers that in Cambodia are often foreign owned by people from China mostly at the moment. So the brands themselves have actually very little direct investment in these factories, and it's one of the things that makes for a very footloose industry. What brands have tended to do over time is what the UK Parliament calls chasing the cheap needle around the planet. And what that basically means is if wages and conditions go up in one place like Cambodia, and that pushes up the cost of production there, brands simply pick up their orders and they take them somewhere else, perhaps Myanmar, where labor happens to be cheaper at that time. And so that's why we've seen the global supply chain, the global precarity chain, let's say, evolve from its initial hubs in places like China to Southeast Asia. And now we're actually seeing the evolution of this precarity chain expand further into kind of what's often called the final frontier of production in places like Africa, especially places like Ethiopia and Lesotho. So obviously one solution to that is stop giving brands the incentive to move between countries. So how could something like ASEAN do that? It's through exactly as I think Raxmay's question suggested, through greater cooperation. And we have seen some efforts during COVID-19 at these types of cooperation. So there has been the initiation of an Asian suppliers network, which essentially aims to create a standard set of conditions so that buyers cannot just look to take orders elsewhere if they want to find lower production costs. But what we probably haven't seen from that business side angle is how these changes are going to become a roadmap for better working conditions or higher wages for workers. But another long-standing initiative that's existed probably for 10 years in the garment sector is the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, which is a group of trade unions and campaign groups. And their goal is to work so that countries within Asia implement what they call a floor wage. So that's a wage where each worker in each individual country has enough of a minimum standard of income to be able to guarantee basic needs, but the wage is not set so low that or too high that that brands and purchasers are incentivized to move elsewhere. And I think also what's really relevant, that maybe just to touch on briefly, that links to very interestingly to Abbey's contributions here, is also that garment workers are not just impacted by what's happening in the garment sector, but they've also been impacted by wider kind of trends in Southeast Asian economics and politics during the COVID-19 pandemic. And actually, one of the things that came through very strongly in our research was that a lot of the households in which there were garment workers, but also transnational migrants, for example, a lot of Cambodians working in places like Thailand, when the borders closed and their husbands couldn't move between places, that also had a really huge impact on household income. So things like border closures as well, obviously, also have their own impact on garment workers' livelihoods in this more indirect manner. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. I think there's a question perhaps that can be directed to Abbey again, and in this case, a question from Gerard McCarthy, who is from National University of Singapore's Asia Research Institute, who's saying a number of speakers touching upon governmental social responses, especially the precarity experienced by those who fell between cracks of COVID-19 or pre-pandemic safety nets. And the question is, how is this exclusion, inadequacy of governmental social role playing out politically in the context you follow? Are governments and parties showing signs of maintaining their extended role beyond COVID? And here I understand Abbey is part of the campaign groups for one of the presidential candidates in the forthcoming presidential election in the Philippines. So perhaps Abbey, you are probably in the best position to comment on this. And I would also welcome Rachel and Sabina if you would like to also add more thoughts here in this regard.
I'm actually joking with my co-authors by chat that this might get us into trouble. My wearing pink is already a form of dissent. So just to add, thank you for that question. It's timely. It's important to surface that the government really plays a pivotal role, and a lot of the sectors severely affected by the pandemic are sadly still taken for granted by the current government. So it's important that we're having the elections in May, because it would really spell the future of the Philippines on whether we will survive this economically. We're at the moment, we are getting deeper into debt. So, and for these people to regain back their footing as the rest of the world is starting to adjust to the new normal, we are still apparently very much stuck with punitive practices and being put in this constant cycle of lockdowns. We slide in and out of lockdowns without proper social safety nets. The poor suffers the most, and the government has continued to ignore clamor from the people, instead of deploying more health workers, we get more military out on the streets trying to impose people, force people to wear face masks and face shields instead of adding doctors in the hospitals. So there's a sign, a glimmer of hope, at least in the context of the Philippines, there's a glimmer of hope that we might be able to shift policies into more humane, dignified way of handling the impact of the pandemic across different sectors, transport workers, health workers, OFWs. And it is important that we surface issues despite attempts of government to silence us. That's the reason why my co-authors and I bravely, although we've been doing this, we've been faced with precarity for the past 5 years, 6 years under this administration. We continue to write about it, to surface, and thank you for LSE for making us part of this panel, to encourage people to speak up and come out and say that a lot of things are wrong with how people are being treated in terms of policies and government response. I'm sorry if I took this opportunity to surface that, but we really needed the avenue and the platform, at least for Filipinos here and abroad, and those in limbo in quarantine facilities to be heard, that we deserve better. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Rachel, perhaps can I hand over to you? Either regarding the governmental political responses, or also regarding the one of the first questions about the regional cooperation, about addressing this digital inequality and the promotion of more inclusive digital policy.
Sure, thanks, Hyun. Maybe I too had better caveat that the opinion I'm about to give here is mine alone and doesn't represent my organization.
Sure.
With respect, I think, to Malaysian politics, those who have been following will be aware that very early on in the pandemic, we changed governments less democratically than one would have liked. And then we changed governments again in August of last year. So there's been some instability there, and coupled with, as has been mentioned, the sort of lack of real social protections and support in dealing with the pandemic, I think is going to play out, well, one hopes is going to play out with some political participation in the next 6 months or so. Certainly next month, there's a state election coming up that I think will give us some insight into what the popular opinion in Malaysia is at the moment. Yeah, but I think one of the controversial policies that has been put out in terms of the government trying to offer some sort of financial aid during the pandemic is to allow people to withdraw from their employee provident funds, essentially their pension savings, and that's not gone over well with people who essentially say, you're basically borrowing from yourself, and that's bad for you long term. But there are other people saying this is the only way that we can offer aid at the time, in a time of crisis. So again, I think we'll have to see how voters respond to that and whether they're in support of the government's decision to do that or not.
Thank you very much. I think we are almost reaching the end of our time. Before we finish, Sabina, would you like to have a final say?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think it's another really great question on the, around government offerings of social protection during the pandemic. And one of the questions that we get asked a lot with the project is, what are the good news stories that came out of it, right? It's been a really difficult time for people, but are there any, silver linings? I hesitate to use that phrase, but along those lines. And I think that, yeah, in Cambodia, one of the amazing things that happened is very quickly in February 2020, when we were experiencing raw material shortages from China in the very early wave of the pandemic here, and the government quite quickly rolled out an unemployment insurance protection program. which is the first of its kind in Cambodia. It had never been existed in the garment sector before. And what that has demonstrated in Cambodia is that the state does have the capacity to provide social protection programs. So yeah, one of the promising things I think from the pandemic is that there can no longer be this kind of excuse that the state doesn't have the capacity to provide social protection for people. Actually, the rollout's been quite successful, and even if the levels of payment protection weren't quite enough to sustain garment workers at the same standard of living they'd been used to, the fact that the state capacity existed and could get money into the hands of people very, very quickly is certainly one of the positive things that's emerged from the pandemic.
Thank you so much. Perhaps Do-young and Murray, would you like to have a final say? Murray?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I suppose that the final thing to say is just thank you to all of you for being here, and it's been so nice to see you all again after quite a while. The thing that strikes me when listening to you and returning to this is how clearly these questions have retained their urgency. And I think for us as editors, so much of our concern was what makes a book like this sustainable. But it just has not proven to be an issue. And certainly it was never about the pandemic then, nor is it now. It becomes actually a method of sorts for just revisiting questions in new ways. It's been striking the way that these sorts of events have changed, but I think this process has also made us think about the way that academic publication will change as well. So thank you to those from the LSE Press who were on the call. It's been a pleasure to work with you, and it's made me think a lot about what a book like this can achieve and what it ought to achieve, and how it brings together people and retains a certain charge. So thank you.
Thank you. Do-young?
Yeah, I think time is running out, and I already have said, my thanks to everyone. So I will just hand it over to Hyun. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Well, many thanks to everyone for taking part today, the speakers and also the members of our audience. And also, let me also thank our LSE Public Events team and SEAC staff for the support provided, and also in particular, LSE Press team led by Professor Patrick Dunleavy as Editor-in-Chief for the support provided in the course of preparing this publication. You can order the book, by the way, by visiting the LSE Press website, but also, more importantly, and to my delight, the book is available as open access, so you can freely download the entire copy free of charge from the LSE Press website. And as a way of concluding, I would like to draw your kind attention to the final chapter in the book entitled "In Pandemic Academia, Scholarly Practices and on Ethics of Care." The chapter is a reflection on academic practices in general and what it means to pursue them during the crisis. And it is this ethics of care that we would like to emphasize as key to thinking about positive social change and keeping our eyes on negative social change from overtaking our lives. So thank you everyone for taking part today again. We hope to see you again soon at a future SEAC and LSE public event. And please keep well and stay safe. Bye-bye.